She said it with a smile. That's the part that still gets me, even now. Not the words themselves, though the words were cruel enough. But the smile, the way she folded her napkin, set it on the table, and delivered it like she was reading off a grocery list. Now that Leonard is gone, you've had your time to grieve. It's time to pack your things and move on. Beverly. My son, my 45-year-old son. The boy I raised. The boy I drove to every baseball practice and stayed up with through every fever. He looked down at his plate and said nothing. He said nothing. I looked at him for a long moment, waiting, hoping. And then he looked up, and he said, "She's right, Mom, this house is too much for one person." That was the moment I understood. Not just that my son had chosen his wife over his mother. I'd accepted that years ago. But that somewhere along the way, he'd stopped seeing me as a person altogether. I was just an inconvenience with a deed attached. My name is Beverly Caldwell. I'm 68 years old. I spent 34 years married to Leonard Caldwell, the most careful, deliberate, quietly brilliant man I've ever known. We built our life together in a blue Craftsman house on Sycamore Ridge Drive in Asheville, North Carolina. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a garden Leonard tended like it was sacred ground. We raised our son, Garrett, in that house. We celebrated 30 Christmases there. We survived a flooded basement, a leaky roof, 2 recessions, and one very difficult year that we don't talk about but that made us stronger. Leonard died of a stroke on a Tuesday morning in March. He'd been sitting in his chair by the window with a cup of coffee, reading the paper. That's how I found him. Peaceful, like he'd just dozed off. The grief of that morning is something I won't try to describe here. Some things don't have words. The dinner where Garrett and his wife Diane delivered their verdict happened exactly 9 days after the funeral. 9 days. I'd made pot roast because it was Leonard's recipe and cooking it felt like keeping him close. The house still smelled like him. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand. His boots were still by the back door. Diane had been unusually quiet all evening. That should have told me something. Diane was never quiet. She filled every silence with opinions about things she'd read online or things her mother had told her. But that night she was watching me the way a realtor watches a house they've already decided to buy. Calculating. Measuring. "Beverly," she said finally, setting down her fork. "Garrett and I have been talking." I looked at my son. He was staring at the tablecloth. "We think it would be best for everyone if you started thinking about other living arrangements. A place more suited to your situation." My situation. As if grief were a real estate category. "This is my home," I said. Quietly, steadily, the way Leonard always said to deliver difficult truths, without heat. But without retreat. "Well," Diane said, and there was that smile. "Technically, the house was in Leonard's name. So now it's Garrett's. You were really just living here as his wife." Just living here. 34 years. Every coat of paint. Every tile we argued about in the bathroom renovation. Every meal I made in that kitchen. Just living there. I turned to Garrett. He finally looked up. "It's practical, Mom," he said. "And Diane and I could really use the space. We've been talking about starting a family." I didn't say another word at dinner. I cleared the plates. I washed the dishes. I listened to Diane mention a lovely senior community out near Weaverville. I smiled when she described the activities calendar. And when they left, I sat down in Leonard's chair by the window. And I made a decision. I would not beg. I would not argue. I would not cry in front of them. But I would go to the bank in the morning. The First Community Bank of Asheville opened at 9. I was in the parking lot at 8:45. Sandra Whitfield had managed this branch for 12 years. She was a compact woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched on her head and the kind of calm authority that suggested she'd handled much worse than a grieving widow before her morning coffee. She offered her condolences with genuine warmth. Leonard had been a regular, she said. Always polite. Always thorough. I need to understand our financial picture, I told her. Leonard handled everything, and I'm realizing I may not know as much as I should. Sandra nodded and turned to her computer. A moment passed. Then another. I watched her expression shift, not alarmed. Exactly, but attentive in a way that made my pulse quicken. Mrs. Caldwell, she said carefully, I'm seeing several accounts here. More than a typical household portfolio. I want to make sure I give you a complete picture. She started with the joint checking account. Comfortable. Enough to cover 6 months of expenses without touching anything else. Then a joint savings account. Significantly larger. The kind of number that makes you sit up straighter in your chair. There are also several accounts in your name only, Sandra said, and something in her voice made me lean forward. My name only. 2 certificate of deposit accounts. Rolling over annually for 6 and 8 years respectively. A money market account receiving quiet, steady transfers. And a trust. The Caldwell Family Protection Trust. Established 4 years ago. Primary and sole beneficiary, Beverly Ann Caldwell. My husband never mentioned any of this to me, I whispered. Sandra was quiet for a moment, choosing her words with care. Sometimes clients establish separate structures when they have concerns about family dynamics, about protecting a spouse from external pressures. External pressures. I thought about the last 4 years. Garrett's rotating series of investment opportunities that always needed a little help getting started. Diane's hints about the house. About our estate. About what things might be worth. The way she'd started calling Leonard Dad, right around the time she learned he owned property in a neighborhood that had appreciated 30%. Leonard had seen it. He'd seen all of it. And he hadn't said a word to me. He'd just started building walls. Sandra printed everything and placed it in a folder with my name on it. The numbers were not modest. They were not emergency funds tucked away for a rainy day. They were a life. Fully funded. Fully mine. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time before driving home. I read through every page twice. And then I thought about Diane's smile at the dinner table. About Garrett staring at the tablecloth. About the words, just living here. They had no idea. Not one single idea. There was one more detail I needed to understand. Sandra had mentioned that the trust was receiving deposits from a separate business account, Caldwell Property Management LLC. Leonard had sold his property management company 6 years ago. That was the official family story. The one Garrett always repeated when anyone asked about his father's retirement. Dad liquidated everything, paid off debts, came out about even. So I drove to the office of Hargrove Financial Consulting on Merriman Avenue, where Leonard had kept a quarterly appointment for as long as I could remember. He'd always gone alone, always told me it was boring paperwork. Robert Hargrove was a lean man in his 60s with the careful eyes of someone who kept other people's secrets for a living. He stood when I came in, and the expression on his face told me he'd been expecting this visit. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, I was hoping you'd come soon. Leonard left very specific instructions for when you did. He didn't sell the company, did he? Robert shook his head. He restructured it, transferred the primary assets into the LLC, which is owned by the trust, which is owned by you. The day-to-day management has been handled by Patricia Norris for the past 5 years. She manages a portfolio of 14 rental properties across Buncombe County. 14 properties. I had to remind myself to breathe. The portfolio generates consistent monthly income. Robert continued, sliding a financial summary across the desk. After Patricia's management fee and property expenses, you're looking at a net annual income that should cover your living expenses quite comfortably, for as long as you live. I stared at the number at the bottom of the page. For as long as you live. Why didn't he tell me? I finally asked, not accusingly, just honestly. Why had my husband of 34 years kept all of this from me? Robert was quiet for a moment. Because he was afraid of what would happen if certain people found out. He was very direct about that in our conversations. He told me, and I'm quoting here, if Garrett knows there's money, Garrett will find a way to need it. And if Diane knows there's money, Garrett won't have a choice. The room felt very still. There's something else, Robert said, pulling out a second folder. Over the past 4 years, Leonard made a series of personal loans to Garrett. Substantial ones. He documented everything properly, payment schedules, interest rates, the works. He handed me the folder. Page after page of loan agreements. All signed by Garrett. All carefully notarized. The total outstanding balance, with accumulated interest and missed payments, was just over $112. $112,000. Garrett, who had sat at my dinner table 9 days after his father's funeral and nodded along while his wife told me to pack my bags, owed the trust I now controlled, $112. I went home that afternoon and I did something I hadn't been able to do since Leonard died. I slept. Not the fragmented, grief-broken sleep of the past 2 weeks. Real sleep. Deep and quiet. The kind that comes when you stop being afraid. When I woke up, I called an attorney named Carol Weston, who a friend from my garden club had described as the kind of woman you want on your side when the family turns on you. I also called Patricia Norris, who managed the property portfolio, and introduced myself as her new direct contact. She was warm and professional and clearly relieved to know the trust had a stable owner. And I did not call Garrett. I did not respond to Diane's text asking whether I'd found a senior community I liked. I let them plan. The confrontation came 11 days later. Right on schedule. Garrett had apparently called Robert Hargrove's office, claiming to be managing his father's estate and requesting access to all financial records. Robert had told him, politely but firmly, that he'd need written authorization from the trust beneficiary. Garrett arrived at the house the next morning with Diane, who was wearing the expression she reserved for conversations she expected to win. I made coffee. I wore the gray dress Leonard always said made me look like I meant business. Mom, I don't know what you've been telling people, Garrett started, but you're creating a lot of unnecessary complications. I haven't been telling anyone anything, I said. I've been listening. And reading. I set the folder from Robert's office on the coffee table. Then the folder from Sandra at the bank. Then the trust documents. Diane reached for them first. I watched her face change as she read. The confident angle of her shoulders slowly dropped. She passed the trust documents to Garrett without a word. He read them twice. This can't be right, he said finally. Dad would have told me. Your father told you exactly as much as he wanted you to know, I said quietly. It turns out that wasn't very much. The business was sold, Garrett said, but his voice had lost its certainty. He told me he sold it and came out even. He restructured it. It's been generating income for 5 years. That income belongs to the trust. I own the trust. Diane's voice, when it came, was very tight. What about the house? The house is still in the estate. I slid another document across the table. Carol Weston had been very thorough. Leonard added me as joint owner with right of survivorship 18 months ago. The house transfers to me automatically. It doesn't go through probate. It's not part of the estate. The silence that followed was the loudest silence I've ever experienced. Diane stood up and walked to the window. I could see her jaw working. Garrett sat very still, looking at the loan documents, his signature, notarized and dated, on 18 separate agreements. He never asked me to repay these, Garrett said finally, his voice hoarse. He never once mentioned a payment schedule. No. He didn't. That was his choice. I kept my voice steady. But the loans are legally valid and the debt is real. And now those loan agreements are assets of the trust, which means they belong to me. Diane turned from the window. You're going to use this against us. I'm going to use this to protect myself, I said. Which is exactly what your father-in-law intended. Garrett finally looked up from the papers. And I saw something in his face I hadn't expected. Not anger. Not calculation. Shame. Real, honest shame. Mom, he said. I'm sorry. It was a beginning. Not enough, not yet, but a beginning. I know, I said. But sorry isn't a legal document. My attorney will be in touch. They tried to fight it. Of course. Diane hired a lawyer who argued that Leonard's financial arrangements constituted elder self-deception, an interesting legal theory that Carol dismantled in her response brief with what I can only describe as elegant efficiency. The investigation that followed was, I think, more illuminating for Garrett than for anyone else. He learned, in formal legal proceedings, exactly how much he'd borrowed, exactly how many times he'd missed payment deadlines his father never enforced, exactly how many times Leonard had quietly topped up the trust account after helping their son, ensuring that what he gave with one hand, he replaced with the other. For me, the settlement was finalized 4 months after that morning confrontation. Garrett acknowledged the full debt and agreed to a structured repayment plan. Diane signed off without comment. I didn't take any satisfaction in the financial victory. Exactly. That wasn't what this was about. What it was about was the look on my son's face when he finally understood the full picture. Not just what his father had left behind. But why? What it said about who they'd been to Leonard in those final years. And what it said about who he'd chosen to become. I still live on Sycamore Ridge Drive. The house is mine now. In every legal and practical sense. I repainted the living room a color I'd always wanted and Leonard had always gently vetoed. It turns out sage green was the right choice all along. Patricia Norris and I have a standing call every other Tuesday. The property portfolio is steady. 2 new tenants this quarter. Both long-term leases. Patricia is meticulous, and I've been learning more every week about how the whole thing works. Leonard would be pleased, I think. Not that I need to manage it all myself, but that I understand it, that I'm not dependent on anyone else's version of what I own. Garrett calls on Sundays. He started 2 months into the repayment period. And I'll admit I let several calls go to voicemail before I picked up. Our conversations are careful, still, feeling their way towards something that might eventually resemble trust. Diane doesn't call. I don't expect her to. Some things don't mend, and I've made my peace with that. What I didn't expect was that the hardest part of all of this wouldn't be the legal battle. Or even the grief. The hardest part was forgiving Leonard. Not for what he did. I understand that clearly now. He protected me the only way he knew how. Quietly and thoroughly, without burdening me with the knowledge of why it was necessary. But there were moments, in the middle of all of this, when I was so angry at him for leaving me unprepared. For not trusting me enough to show me the fortress he'd been building. For letting me spend 34 years not knowing what was really in our accounts. What our son really owed us. What our life was actually worth. And then I'd sit in his chair by the window. And I'd think about the kind of love that plans ahead. That stays quiet to keep the peace but keeps meticulous records. That looks at the people sitting around the dinner table and calculates. Carefully and without bitterness, what the future might require. He knew me well enough to know I couldn't carry that knowledge without it changing something between us. And he loved me enough to carry it himself. Some evenings I sit on the porch with a glass of sweet tea and I talk to him. Not out loud. Just in the quiet way you talk to people who aren't there but aren't entirely gone either. I tell him about Patricia's updates and the new paint color and the Sunday calls from Garrett. I tell him I'm learning to balance a spreadsheet, which I think would have made him laugh. And I tell him thank you. For the fortress. For the patience. For knowing, long before I did, that someday I'd need to stand on my own, and making absolutely certain I could. The porch is mine. The house is mine. The evening is mine. And for the first time in a very long time, so am I. If you've been underestimated by someone who should have known better, you're not alone. And if you're managing your own finances for the first time, start today. Not tomorrow. Today. Drop the city you're watching from in the comments below. I read every single one. And when you're ready, there are 2 more stories waiting on the end screen that I think you're really going to feel. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for not looking away from the hard things.